In her first annual report, the boss of the schools watchdog says there's a group of underperforming schools that continue to let down pupils. Amanda Spielman is the Chief Inspector of Schools, and she says of those schools inspected this year, around 80 primary and 50 secondary schools have not been good at any point for over a decade. Why? I spoke to her a little earlier and asked her what she thought about those stats.
On the one hand, it's bad news. Clearly, we shouldn't have any schools in that state. There is good news, though, that the number is very much smaller than it was a few years ago. So I think this tells us we really need to focus now on squeezing these kinds of problems out of the system completely.
But what does it mean for pupils if their school is failing year after year?
Well, that's exactly why we shouldn't have any schools in that state.
What does it mean for their life chances?
It means their life chances are uncertain. It doesn't mean that everybody's life is written off, but it means many of them will have a less good experience than they should, which will knock on all the way through in their education after school, in their careers. So it's really, really important that we make sure that everybody gets the best school education they possibly can.
And you say in this report that having disadvantaged pupils is not enough of a reason for a school to continue to fail.
Yes, I'm saying that if we get distracted by the game of disadvantage one-upmanship, my school's got more pupil premium children than your school, we can get distracted, we can get fixated. We need to concentrate on the things that are really important to making a school good, having a good curriculum, good teaching and good behaviour in the classroom and corridors. We've got to make everybody focused on what can be done, not on all the difficulties to achieving it.
But what is interesting is these schools that continually fail and have done for over a decade, they have had external help, they've had outside help, and yet they are still failing. That doesn't seem to make sense.
They have, and perhaps the kind of help they've had hasn't been quite focused enough on building the capacity inside of the school.
What does that mean in plain English?
Well, if you prop schools up from outside, it's great while you've got the props there, but once that support goes away, then the school slips back again. We've got to really concentrate on what it is to get everything in place, the people, the curriculum, the systems, everything inside the school really, really working as strongly as it can.
So does that mean...
And that's the point at which we can say the job is done, and the school should be able to go forward strongly.
Does that mean discipline of the students, a good senior leadership team? What do you mean? What are the basics?
I think it's focus above all else, not getting distracted by great numbers of interventions and initiatives. Having too many things to deal with makes the job harder. Keeping it as simple as it can be. And it may be that we do need extra resource in some of these intractable schools to make this possible.
But focus on what? Be specific.
Focus on the curriculum, on the teaching and on the behaviour. Those things above all else. That's the job of good school leaders, is to make those things work well.
Being a head, being a senior leader in a school is a really hard job.
Certainly is.
Do you understand when people get burnt out and leave, and then the cycle begins again?
Yes, indeed. And that's why this focus is so important, because part of it is about making the job doable. If you can keep the job of running a good school as simple as it can be made, then you minimise... it's a high-stress job, but you minimise the unnecessary stress and strain on teachers. So I think getting this right actually has the potential to help retain more teachers, have fewer people leaving because of stress and burnout.
You talk in your report about multi-academy trusts, and for our audience that means a collection of often very good schools, and they fan out into the community to spread good practice. But there aren't enough of those, are there, to take up those schools that aren't doing as well?
There aren't yet enough of them, and they're not necessarily in the right places where help is needed for the toughest schools. So yes, we need to look at ways to get more support from the schools who've got the capacity to do it into the schools that need it most, but with the focus on building this long-term capacity inside those schools.
You also say in your report, which is really interesting, increases in test scores do not necessarily reflect an improvement in education standards. What do you mean?
What I mean is when schools get very focused on teaching a mark scheme rather than teaching the subject, teaching a particular type of question that they think is likely to come up in a test rather than teaching the maths, then you may be able to push test scores up, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the children have learnt more maths. So what I've been talking about all year is about the substance of education, about making sure that we all stay focused on making sure that children have the full experience that they should have, that they learn everything that they should, that they don't just get a good grade, a lovely sticker, that they actually really learn.
And how worried are you that schools are increasingly becoming focused on exam results being the be-all and end-all?
Well, our curriculum survey work that's in progress, but we have already put out one commentary this year, suggested that this is quite a significant problem. And at many stages of education, we found it in primary schools, we found it in Key Stage 3, that's 11 to 14-year-olds, and we found it in the GCSE years.
OK. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Amanda Spielman. Right, let's talk now to Jeff Barton. He's the General Secretary of the Association of School and College Leaders, and also Rebecca Handley-Kirk, who took over the newly formed Hewitt Academy in Norwich 2 years ago after the previous school was placed into special measures. Thank you so much for talking to us. Rebecca, let me begin with you. Taking over a failing school, tell our audience about the challenges.
Lots of challenges. Firstly, we have to look at the behaviour of the students, the teaching and learning that's going on in the classrooms, and the opportunities available to the students. It's really an approach across the board, and it needs strong leadership to ensure it happens.
And of course, because it was failing, I think, for 10 years before you took over, that means student numbers drop because people don't want to send their kids there.
Absolutely. Student numbers are still continuing to drop. They're looking a little bit more positive for next September, but it's definitely a long haul to turn around those public perceptions to see that the school is changing and good things are happening there.
Yeah. And let's just talk about your exam results this summer, because I think there was a 19% improvement in maths and English GCSEs. Is that reputation, is that message getting out there in the community?
I think it's a long process. Though that first set of results were fantastic, and we're looking to make similar improvements again this year. But I think it takes a few years for that to filter through to the general public. So we are still looking at lower pupil numbers than we would want.
How do you get parents on side? How do you make sure parents are engaged? Now, look, I saw you sort of sigh then, as though that is a really big deal.
It's a huge deal, and it's one of our biggest challenges. Making parents aware that, you know, they have a huge input into their students, their child's education, and making sure that they want to engage. And actually, it's one of my biggest challenges.
Right. Let me bring in Jeff Barton. Then you say that OFSTED judgments themselves can be stigmatising and potentially make things worse. What do you mean?
They can do, and if we just listen to the language that we're framing the debate in today, and we're talking about failing schools, we need to be careful, I think, with that. Because what Ofsted appear to be saying is that since 2005, there are 130 schools in England which have not got a good or an outstanding judgment. And those parents, you know, deserve, with their communities, to expect that there's going to be a good school there. But what they also say is there are no quick fixes here.
Well, but these schools that we're talking about today have been failing for over 10 years.
Yeah, I'm not using the word failing. What I'm saying is that in terms of the Ofsted categories, they haven't had a good and they haven't had an outstanding. They've had a requires improvement.
Fine.
They might have had a
for over 10 years. So
Absolutely.
When you say there are no quick fixes, that's a long time. That's 12 years we're talking about.
And you listen to what Rebecca says there, and schools are rooted in their communities. And there's a tension, I think, in what we've heard, because we heard Amanda Spielman, who I think is doing a great job in many ways as Chief Inspector, but she says, don't fixate on exam results. And then what you're hearing there is schools are judged by their exam results, and Ofsted will be looking at their exam results in their judgment. And I think what we have to do in the system is recognise that the kind of things that you and I probably with our children would expect a great school to do, and you implied it earlier, which is to reach out to their community to give great stuff in the classroom and great stuff around the classroom, extracurricular work. That's more difficult in challenging schools because you can't recruit the staff and you can't hold on to the leadership. And Ofsted are saying that today. So the big question for the government is, what do we do to give a long-term sense that these schools are beacons of hope instead of what they can be, which is beacons of despair?
Well, they're trying to help. The Department for Education says we're targeting the areas that need the most support through our Opportunity Areas scheme, and by investing £280 million over the next 2 years to target resources at the schools most in need of improving school performance.
Absolutely right. And on a day when essentially 90% of schools in this country are good and outstanding, and that should be celebrated.
Well, we did mention that, we did talk about that with the Chief Inspector.
Now, all help needs to go to those schools. And part of that is getting leaders who are on a mission to stay with those communities, to be known by those communities. For leadership teams not to be squandering money on supply teachers who are there for half a term and then disappear, paying extortionate fees.
Well, sometimes you can't help that. I mean, if a teacher leaves or gets pregnant or is burnt out.
It would be more difficult if we're saying this is a failing school, this is a school which the community has lost faith in. And what we have to do is to recalibrate that, and resources need to go to those schools in the way the government is talking about. Ofsted, I think, would do us a favour if what they did was to assign their best inspectors to work with those schools to hold to mirror up to help those schools in the longer term, because what we need is the best leaders to go and stay with those schools and communities and to give a real sense in places that probably haven't had a great sense that schools matter, that they matter a huge amount.
OK. Rebecca, tell our audience what motivates you.
The students, really. It's seeing those outcomes and seeing happy students leaving school with lots of opportunities and choices. They can choose to do anything they want to do in the future, and I think that is vital, opening as many doors as possible for them.
And do you ever think this is too much, actually? This is exhausting and too challenging, and actually it might be a job for someone else?
It is a challenge, it's a big challenge, but I have an awful lot of support around me, and I think that's been vital in the improvements at the Hewitt Academy. I have an executive principal who I can speak to if I've got any concerns, and I have the SET Academy that are supporting us with teaching and learning and behaviour. So it's really about the support network to keep me in post and keep me pushing for those improvements.
OK, a couple of comments from people watching you talk from around the country. Dave on Facebook says, schools don't fail students, parents do. It all starts at home. Whereas Donk says schools have been failing children for decades, generation after generation of kids leaving school unprepared for the real world. And a couple more. Duncan says it's easy to blame teachers in challenging schools. Although I don't think we have had that conversation this morning, to be fair to us. Smaller class sizes.
More great teachers.
Smaller class sizes are a simple solution, although nothing is ever simple, but fair enough, Duncan. And Go Sketch on Twitter says we need to stop talking about failing schools and start inspiring children with more than maths and English exams. Thank you both. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Good luck, Rebecca. Thank you. Rebecca Handley-Kirk, who took over the newly formed Hewitt Academy in Norwich a couple of years ago after the previous school was placed in special measures, and Jeff Barton from the Association of School and College